I'm one lit teacher, and today we're going to talk about Shakespeare's Sonnet 29.
Sonnet 29 is one of the poems in Shakespeare's sonnet cycle of 154 sonnets. It begins, "When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes." It's a very heavy opening to a poem. This is one of the poems written to the young man. So again, this is a Shakespearean or English sonnet, and like all sonnets, that makes it a 14-line poem in iambic pentameter. It does have the particular Shakespearean rhyme scheme, AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG, which is 3 quatrains and then a rhyming couplet. The theme is introduced in quatrain 1, developed further in quatrain 2, and then in this particular sonnet, rather than developing it further, it actually changes or turns the theme and the tone with a volta at the beginning of quatrain 3 in line 9. And then the idea is resolved in the rhyming or heroic couplet. A heroic couplet, by the way, is just a rhyming couplet in iambic pentameter. So here I have some of those structural elements marked. Again, iambic pentameter is 5 units of iambs, and an iamb is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. And of course, Shakespeare writes everything in iambic pentameter. And it follows that rhyme scheme. You can see it marked here. The punctuation and transitions will also help us see the different units in a sonnet. So while we don't have stanzas that are set apart with spaces, we can still see the units if we look at the clues embedded in the poem by the sonneteer. So, for example, we have some transitions. Those frequently occur at the beginnings of quatrains. Here, when at the very beginning of the poem, and then yet at the turn in the volta at line 9, and then for where that sort of resolution is beginning at the beginning of the couplet. So something interesting about this poem is that it doesn't have a lot of end punctuation, and that helps with the momentum of the poem, this idea that the speaker is sort of desperate to get through this catalog of reasons why he feels horrible about himself, and this list of ideas about what makes him a despisable being. And that's really interesting. And then by the time we get to the semicolon at the end of quatrain 2, there's a little break there for breath catching. And then yet he feels a little bit differently in quatrain 3, and absolutely peaceful by the couplet. And again, there's a semicolon at the end of the 3rd quatrain. So what does Shakespeare have to feel so downtrodden about? We should take a look at that, and we can do that with the marking. But Shakespeare does make the tone of the poem a very obvious feature from the very beginning. So I decided to start with that, emotionally charged negative diction in my color marking. I've done that with red, so I underlined words like disgrace, alone, beweep, outcast, trouble, deaf heaven, bootless cries. And by the way, bootless in this sense means futile. These cries or these prayers are not reaching heaven. Curse my fate, wishing me, as if he's wishing for something that he's lacking. Desiring, with what I most enjoy, contented least. A little bit of antithesis here. I didn't mark separately as such, but it's a very sullen idea. He is despising himself. That's a really interesting revelation, because despising is a pretty heavy emotion. And then towards the end, sullen earth and scorn. But the positive diction takes over for the most part in quatrain 3. Happily, like to the lark at break of day arising, sings hymns, heaven's gate, sweet love and wealth. So, there is definitely a change in the emotion or the tone in quatrain 3. So what is causing the speaker to be so upset? Again, he's alone, he's outcast. His cries are not going up to heaven because he's cursed. But quatrain 2 is particularly interesting. It's as if the poet is pointing to different people and saying, I wish I could be more like him and more like him. And some of the reasons are really, really interesting. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope. This could involve money and optimism. Featured like him. I want to maybe look more like him with friends possessed, be somebody who's maybe a little bit more gregarious and not so alone. But the second half of quatrain 2 is particularly enlightening. Desiring this man's art and that man's scope with what I most enjoy contented least. Shakespeare, the bard, the most famous writer in the history of the English language, is saying, I wish my art, the scope of my work, was as good as that man's. And that's really interesting. What he most enjoys, he is least contented with. And so that really helps us to see why he is despising himself at this point. But then what happens to change his feeling is that he thinks of the young man, his friend, and this causes his spirit to turn around. And that really shows us a powerful idea about what we can do to raise each other up in life. So the negative tone becomes a positive tone as Shakespeare again creates this forward-moving momentum and then a strong turn at the beginning of quatrain 3. So I extended my color marking a bit here. I marked repetition, and I'm not going to talk about every word that I see repeated, but to me the most important one is state. And the orange, unfortunately, gets a little bit hard to distinguish from the pink, but state is in line 2 and again comes in line 10 and then in the last line of the poem. At the beginning, it's an outcast state. And then his state in quatrain 3 is like to the lark at break of day arising. It's this spiritual uplifting idea. And then by the end, he wouldn't change his state with kings. So there's also a little bit of perhaps a great chain of being idea here. He's an outcast. He feels like an outcast at the beginning, at the low end of the great chain of being, which was a system in Elizabethan times of structure in society. And the king is at the top. He's like God on earth. But Shakespeare's saying, I wouldn't change my place with the king by the end, because that's how much better he feels when he thinks about what the friendship is doing for him. So I also marked the wealth motif because it's clear that Shakespeare's talking about different kinds of wealth and riches. By the end of the poem, the wealth comes from spiritual connections with other people. There's a bit of a sound motif, which also kind of parallels that raising of the spirit of the speaker. At the beginning, his cries are bootless and heaven is deaf. But by the end, his state, his soul, his spirit is like to the lark at break of day arising and singing hymns that are rising up towards heaven's gate. So we have this upward lifting idea in the poem, which is really, really beautiful. So I've also marked that simile, like to the lark at break of day arising. And again, that kind of helps with the uplifting idea and the spiritual idea. A little bit of sound devices here that might be useful. They don't take center stage in this poem, but I have marked some alliteration, and I think perhaps the most important aspect of that is the sibilance with the S alliteration towards the end of the quatrain 3 and then in the couplet. And it really contrasts with the cacophony of the consonants that's really heavy, especially in the beginning of the poem with curse, like, and so on. But even comes in with lark and break and then is really lifted and relieved with that S alliteration or sibilance towards the end of the poem, and that gives it more of an airy spiritual feel, which is part of the message of the poem towards the end. So the speaker of the poem is Shakespeare himself. This is a lyric or personal emotional poem, and it's really sort of humbling and interesting to learn that the bard himself felt inferior to others even in his art. And so that can make us all as human beings realize that we all are subject to feelings of inferiority and depression. So the poem highlights the universal human frailties like feelings of inadequacy and being mired down in depression. And it kind of works us through this cycle of that feeling, almost like this manic depressive cycle. So the theme is the power of love and friendship to conquer human miseries and provide spiritual healing and restore self-worth. So even though it starts out a very melancholy poem, it provides us as readers a little bit of healing by the end. I hope you enjoyed thinking about Sonnet 29. You can get a little bit of advice from Shakespeare in this poem about what to do when you feel this way. Shakespeare may be sort of saying, come into the light like I did. So you can come into the light when you feel depressed as well, and realize that even Shakespeare, the bard, sometimes felt this way. And the message is to find joy in what or who really matters, and spiritual connections with others are really important. And Shakespeare's telling us that. I hope that you enjoyed this quick presentation on Sonnet 29. If you did, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, for more presentations about poetry, Shakespeare's sonnets, and other great works of literature.